Welcome to the Does Anything Matter podcast, where Patrick and Pepin talk about the most age-old question of does anything actually matter?
All right, well, hello everybody, and welcome to Damn Podcast. My name's Patrick, and this is Pepin.
Yo, I'm Pepin. I'm here. I'm ready, and we're gonna have a conversation about something. What? I don't know. Patrick's gonna explain.
What we do here, we usually talk about does anything matter, right? And that could be philosophy, it could be something uh, very meta, or it could be just day to day. And so I think today we're going to do a little bit of both, and we're going to talk about money, and specifically, can you buy happiness? Is there a certain amount of money that people need to be happy, or is it something that in of itself is it self-defeating?
hmm
I don't know. What do you think?
So I think my first thought is that it goes in a little bit to I think is it Maslow? I forget the guy's name, but there's a hierarchy of needs, and there's like basic
Yes, Maslow.
yeah, there's like basic security is number one, then kind of these higher needs. So I think you need and maybe that doesn't, some people argue there's a difference between finance and say standards of living or like say basic living, right? Because they say like maybe having a basic shelter and everything, maybe it's not a standard of finance, maybe it's a standard of say capitalism or some other entity that's just separate from it. But I gotta disagree. I think finance is kind of embodying, say, just goods and products in general, and it's kind of providing a abstract manifestation of that entity. So I think that ties into Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and so I think the higher up you get in that hierarchy, the less happiness it brings you. And I would say that once you get fully satisfied in that, you can still get gains of happiness, but I don't think there's a big difference between being a millionaire, a 10 millionaire, a billionaire, and so on. Like, there's probably gradations there. There's probably is a difference, but it's not like as guaranteed as going from, say, not having any shelter or any food to having shelter and food.
So you're saying there's diminishing returns on what happiness you can achieve from having money.
Right, you're right. And I wouldn't say just diminishing returns because I think once you get to that point, then there's like large diminishing returns, but it's kind of like as you climb the hierarchy of needs, you kind of get you could say a greater rate of return, but it's really just greater capability because it's like it's kind of like when you are at this kind of stage where you don't have a shelter, you don't have food, like you're not really in a situation where you can't be happy. Whereas when you start satisfying those needs, it gives you that ability to kind of be happy, and people can survive through a lot of different things. So I'm not saying it's not possible for someone to have nothing and have a sense of joy and wonder and so on and so forth, but it's not as likely.
See, I personally agree, but before we did this, before we're having this conversation here, I kind of knew we might talk about this. So I asked other people what their opinions were, just out of curiosity. And I've heard quite a few people say that they don't think money has anything to do with happiness. And I'm always curious about this because, like, what you're saying is, let's say that you don't have a job and you're constantly worried every day about how you're going to pay your bills. I mean, to me, that seems like a situation where I'm not maximizing my happiness. I might have individual moments where I'm happy, but I think that overall, I'd always be thinking like I could have these exact moments, but also I could not be stressed about paying my bills.
hmm Right.
Right? What do you think?
So I think people will often delude themselves into a fantasy where like they're trying to pretend like this thing doesn't matter. Like, these people aren't any more happy than regular people. I think there's elements of truth there. I don't think people who are, like, say, multimillionaires are necessarily that better off than people who aren't. At the same time, I think people will often downplay the importance of certain things in order to try to act like it doesn't matter. Because I think monetary means do matter. And I think there's exceptions to those rules. Like, take a monk. Like, monks live out in the middle of nowhere. They don't have much of anything going on, but they achieve some sort of ultimate bliss sometimes. But I think on general, I think most people are just kind of lying or fluffing the truth there, or they're watching too many Disney story tales and kind of abstracting what they're trying to get from that message.
So let me ask you this, and I'm just going to preface this by saying if anybody is watching this that hasn't watched our podcast before, and doesn't know, I've mentioned this a few times, but I do subscribe to many Buddhist tenets. And so you mentioned monks, but I'm going to say, even prefaced with the fact that, I do believe in enlightenment and concepts of Buddhism. But do you think that there's some degree of delusion to that? Because you think, okay, if you decide that you're going to live the life of a monk and you're going to be solitary and you're going to swear off uh, selfish need, okay, is that just a delusion that over years and years of practice that you convince yourself is reality? Or is it the other way around? Is it that everyone has been indoctrinated to believe that materialism is necessary for happiness, and that the people who become like the monks, who choose an alternative lifestyle, those people are actually the ones who, no pun intended, but become enlightened?
I think there is a false distinction there, and I think this is what kind of like a lot of extreme Buddhist teachings kind of find that there's no necessary delineation between, say, uh, subject and object from the internal and the outside. And the idea is that once you kind of realize that there's no difference between you and the outside, that everything is kind of one, that focusing on things which are purely external is kind of like an illusory thing, because the external is you, at least as far as your perceptual kind of understanding. And that you can actually gain this sort of, say, enjoyment from, instead of seeking externally, you can seek it internally. So there's no distinction there. But I don't think it's delusion. Well, I think the delusion is that there's a difference between external and internal in that way, or that's at least would be the claim. But I don't think they're deluding themselves necessarily. I think they're just having a more foundational, fun, like reality type experience. And that leads to a different result because they have no reason to strive outside themselves, because there is no difference between outside and inside for them.
I think I agree. It's not a delusion, but it's a paradigm shift. It is that we take what you and I participate in every day. We go to work, we earn money, we buy a house, and we buy a car, we buy lattes. These are all things that we participate in every day because it's what we know. But is it that we're deluded, or is it that we just don't know how to change the paradigm? And I think that's where you're going with that, really, is that at some point, if you get tired of the grind and you think, okay, maybe I'm not achieving happiness by doing this, so maybe I should try and shift the conversation.
Yeah, well, I
I
think
mean, is that what you're saying?
kind of. Well, I think that they just have a different model, and that model might be more accurate to, say, how the brain actually works. But I don't think that it's necessarily good or bad. I think it's just a different way of doing things. Maybe it's a more accurate way of doing things, or more holistic way. Maybe it's more sustainable. But I don't think there's any issue with people in general. Okay, I'll preface this because I don't think there's any issue with people, say, living a life of externalities, of living a life of pleasure, and just kind of having these external things feed into them. Because I think that's also kind of normal. I think kind of going the other side's kind of irregular too. But I kind of see it more as like an Aristotelian mean. You want a, say, rich external life combined with a rich internal life, and kind of have like some sort of medium balance. And maybe some people shift one way or the other, but I think both are fine and workable, and can provide you a level of happiness. But I think definitely leaning towards more external is probably more on the unhealthy side, because it's not sustainable, because you can't maintain your external environment to the same degree that you can maintain your internal environment. Or at least you could say that the degree to which you are able to maintain your internal environment and have that manage your external environment, that could, say, lead to a greater level of happiness. But the idea that you place everything on the external environment, well, you can't control that to any full extent, so you're going to be, say, experiencing some trifles there. Now, you can kind of solve that paradox of, not controlling anything. And it's kind of like the Buddhist kind of teaching. I mean, there's different Buddhist teachings, but that's kind of one idea. You kind of dissolve this idea of control, and then there's no difference, and you can enjoy any moment, even if you're burning alive.
So that's probably why hedonism doesn't work, right? Because we don't actually control the external environment. And yes, it would be optimal if we constantly lived a life of luxury and sex and indulgence and all the things that we want, right? And this has shifted a little bit away from money, which is actually the topic of the conversation. So I want to like kind of pull this back a little bit. And And what we're really trying to examine here is the link between money and pleasure. And pleasure can take many forms. In this case, we're just saying, in general, is it possible to live a a lifestyle that maybe you form this lifestyle that you think is going to make you happy, and is it actually possible to do this without money, right? And maybe some people achieve it, like the Buddhists that we keep discussing here, but is it because they have recognized that they can't control the external environment, so they're creating this sort of coping? And so when I originally said like delusion, I don't think that was the right word. I think really what it is that it's changing the paradigm. It's a way of coping with lack of control over the external environment. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, I think I would agree. And I'm gonna bring it a weird kind of area here because I think coping is the right word, but another word might be strategy. Because one strategy that a lot of people take up with, say, saving money and kind of becoming wealthy is that of, like, say, minimalism, where they will say, I don't need, this fancy car. I can just, drive this 7-year-old car until it, breaks down and dies. I don't need this fancy house. I just need, like, a house that will get me by. I need to buy all the newest things, this brand new TV, this is that. I don't have to go out to lunch and dinner and buy these lattes. So they kind of minimize their lifestyle, and this is a strategy to get them the end they want. And you could say they're not living the life of luxury, but they're also kind of living well. In a similar way, you could have someone who's maybe not living, maybe don't make a whole ton of money, but they kind of, spend their money well and, keep their life down. And the hassle of the external environment is not really present in their life because they're controlling their things well enough. So they're kind of taming the environment to their own, say needs, and kind of controlling your finances in that way, and kind of like you're getting a head on, where it's like a lot of solving the issue of money and finances is creating a situation where you don't have to worry about your finances and money, where you're not creating this kind of dependence, number one, on certain things that you need, because then when those things go away, you're kind of screwed and you're in a state of disarray. But also where it's like the external environment doesn't act on you as much. So let's say that your job, ends. Let's say you get fired or, they just go bankrupt or whatever. Then in that case, you're not too worried because you have some backup savings. Maybe you're still worried, but you're not worried about any, say, accident or anything happening, is potentially going to bankrupt you. So I think there is that factor there of managing your money well will give you better degree of security. And that security can create a more suitable, say, environment for happiness. Would you agree with that, or would you say a little bit off there?
I agree, but really, I think that what you're saying is true, but it's not the entire question.
Mhm.
Because the truth is, yes, you can tailor your lifestyle to a certain degree of wealth. So if I say that really my primary concern is in life is that I want to travel a few times a year and I want to be able to write books, and as long as I can do that, I don't really need much else. Like I could have a modest place to live. I could just have one vehicle, and I could ride that vehicle into the ground, like you said, and
Mhm.
I could buy a used car. And I don't have to go out to eat all the time. These are things I don't care about. I can make those choices. You're absolutely right. But and that would meet my lifestyle. So maybe. But ultimately I still need some money for that, right? There has to be some allocation.
Mhm.
And so the real question is, could you be happy if you had no money? So in the example that you lost your job, what if you never had a job after that and you had to rely on someone else, whether that's the government or whoever it is? But let's say that there's never a chance for you to get the amount of money that would be required for the lifestyle that you desire.
Mhm.
Is it possible for you to be happy, like to accept that and to simply live under the means presented to you?
I think it depends on the person because I think in the case of, like, say, you and I, probably not, because we are both trying to achieve or strive for something a little bit more. But there's plenty of people I've met who they don't have any, say, meaning beyond the horizon of their life. So most people, they come home and they watch TV and they spend a little bit of time with friends, with family, and that's all they need to kind of give their life meaning and purpose. And a lot of people, they just have a kid and their kid's their life's meaning. It's not, there's no need anything beyond that. And so long as job is like a means to an end, it's not the end in itself, or it's not what's allowing, say, some greater, avenue to open up. So I think most people, if they had to live out on, say, handouts their whole life or on a trust fund or anything like that, I don't think that they're going to be, say, not traumatized, but they're going to be just fine with that because, that's all they need to do is just get by. So by myself, I don't think I'm in that category, but I think you and I are not in that category, but other people are. So I think it's a case by case basis.
Yeah, I mentioned before, I talked to a lot of different people about this before we did this podcast. And actually, most people fall in that camp where they claim that they would be perfectly happy without money. And I'm not trying to be sexist here, but I will tell you that most of the people who say that they'd be happy without money are women. And when I ask them what the motivation for that is, a lot of them say that it's because they savor moments, not material. And that seems like an answer that is less likely to come from men. And I don't know if that's a societal problem, if it's something that has been created over time, or if it's something that is inherent. But it is an observation that I made. And it's not the first time, like prior to this podcast, this isn't the first time I've discussed this topic with people. It's come up throughout my whole life. And it's a fairly common trend that things tend to go that way. And so it makes me wonder if we were all kind of conditioned this way as we were being raised, like taught that money doesn't matter, and we were able to kind of create that culture, would we be so ambitious? Or is that ambition inherent? That's something I've always wondered.
I mean, I think my opinion on that, and I definitely want to hear a reaction to this, is that I think people misunderstand money and finance in general. Just kind of what I was saying towards the beginning, because people will, the economic term for money is a medium of exchange, meaning that it's like kind of air is the medium through which sound waves travel. It's not the actual sound waves are, the medium, or it's not the actual sound waves are, say, the air, but it's traveling through the air and it's going to another person. In the same way, money is the medium of exchange, and we're not going to live without exchange because there's only a couple possibilities as far as, like, say, what happens in real life. Everything's about movement in reality. So, like, if I want something, I need some food, you give me some food, there's an exchange there. And maybe you don't hand me, maybe I don't hand anything back or something like that. Maybe it's not an actual exchange, maybe it's just a one-sided exchange, but it's still an exchange, something for nothing. Or you could have exchange for something for something. And there's always going to be, say, that sort of dynamic with things, because that's just how things work. So whether there's this medium there, which is kind of a general catch-all where you exchange money for the thing, which has some sort of abstract value, or whether it's something in general, I think people have a hard time really placing the value of something because money is so abstract. Like my phone here, this phone costs $800 or something. What does this phone actually represent? What does $800 show? We talk about, say, the parts of each price and how they go together, and how maybe the price of this phone to make is actually, say, only $100 and you're selling it for $800. And you can talk about the research and development. You can talk about all these different aspects that go into the phone: marketing, sales, profit, and how profit connects to everything. Money is a very abstract thing, and I think people are right to kind of say more about what money brings them, more about what money represents on a more, say, realistic scale. But I also think that money can't be strictly unlinked from what it gains, because money is a means to those things. You can't have that cruise in Jamaica without the money to get there. You could say, well, if we're in a moneyless society, then, there is a way to get there. And okay, that's true, but that way is through, say, means. And like I said, the money is a medium. So if it's not, say, money doing that, then it's other things, fuel, airplanes, and everything. It's just like a placeholder for what it actually represents. And I want to know if you agree with that, or if you can, like, explain what I'm trying to say better.
So it's not about the money. In other words, you're saying that really what it is that you have this idea in your head of what your life looks like, or what outcomes you'd like to receive, and you are willing to put forth a certain amount of effort to receive those outcomes. And if that effort is going to work to earn a certain amount of money, because the money is then the medium that's used to achieve the outcome that you wanted, then you're willing to do that. So it's not necessarily about the money, it's about the willful exchange of goods. And you're saying I'm willing to put forth a certain amount of effort, whether that effort is earning money or whether it's some type of barter. Like maybe I have something or I'm willing to do a favor for you in exchange for another favor. But whatever it is, it's a willful exchange that you make because there's some perception that the outcome will make you happier, right? Is that what you're trying to say?
It's essentially because I think people try to like act like these experiences are outside of say exchange sort of a dynamic where they kind of discount that even if there was no money that there'd still be resources involved. If you're taking a trip around say India or some other country, there's still resources involved getting there and so on and so forth, even in say the moneyless society. And kind of saying money doesn't matter, it's all about the experience. Well, even in a non-monetary society, you'd still need these resources to get there. And how are you going to get those resources? In the current culture, money is the answer to that because money is just it's a technical solution to a problem of bartering. Because bartering, you need someone who's going to accept your barter, right? Because if you're going to trade apples for a plane trip to Africa, you need someone who's going to be willing to exchange those two. So it's that medium, that common kind of unit of exchange. But it's kind of out not looking at these experiences as being say having some sort of resourceful value. I'm just making up a word there. It's kind of a little bit misleading because you can certainly have those kind of exchanges. So like exchanges with friends and family and so on and so forth. Those are going to be say non-monetary because if you have a friendship, if you have like a romantic partner and everything, there's not necessarily a resource kind of equivocation there. But when most people bring this stuff up, they talk about like going on trips to like Paris, to India. They talk about going places and kind of doing things and kind of the food that was there in Mexico. And they have all these experiences that they're talking about. Those experiences have like some sort of say resource exchange there, and that's required. And to try to act like the experience could exist without that resource exchange, which money is kind of playing the placeholder value of.
Yeah. Okay, so I just want to you mentioned something and it made me think of an example and I just have to sneak this in there. You know my opinions on this topic, but if we're talking about, let's say that we have a moneyless society,
Mhm.
and people ironically think that capitalism is evil and that the concept of capitalism is evil, and one of the reasons why is because it creates wealth allocation, right? That one person, the more money you get, the easier it is for you to obtain money and beyond that. But if you think about it, there's an example of why bartering doesn't work in a modern society, right? It works in a survival situation because it's necessary. But let's say that you have an island and there's 100 people on it, and it's a tropical island, and there's only certain resources available. And what's going to be the best resource on that island? Like if you had to guess, if I had to guess, I would say fish,
Mhm.
because you're on an island. So what's actually on the physical land is going to be limited, but it's likely that the fish is going to be unlimited. So if you have a choice, if there's no money in this society and the only way that you're going to be able to obtain goods is through bartering, if I had a choice, I'm going to become a fisherman. So how many people in that community do you think would become a fisherman? I would say quite a few of them. And even if you put some type of mandate in place where you're saying we're going to have this commune, and in this commune there has to be a certain number of banana growers, there have to be a certain number of coconut harvesters, and there's going to be a certain number of lumberjacks and fishermen, etc. You make a whole list, right? So maybe you could allocate who's going to do what in a way that technically makes things even. But then is it still a fair barter? Because if you're a lumberjack, you might have to work harder than somebody that harvests coconuts. But then you'd be expected to trade your goods at whatever rate someone else wants. And technically, maybe the fish is going to be more valuable than the wood. But there's nothing to suggest that it was easier to gain, right? And so this is why money is a good medium, because money is it's a filter. It's something that we can put our outputs through. So you get a certain amount per hour based on how difficult the work is. And some people can argue that there's flaws to that system and there's inequities in the way people are paid, but that's a whole other conversation. I just think that people saying in general that money is not a good thing for a society, it's very good because it allows us that filter so that we don't have to choose our profession or we don't have to, like, we're free to do whatever we want. We don't have to choose a path that's based on what optimal outputs people might expect from us. Do you
Yeah,
know what I'm trying to say? Does that make sense?
yeah. So another way to add on to one way to add on to this as well is that monetary systems are not going to be never going to be perfect, and you could say that from an economics point of view, there's always going to be, say, some sort of equilibrium, and people, prices are going to fluctuate up and down. There's always going to be, say, things which are overvalued, things which are undervalued. But if you look at a bartering society, it doesn't solve that issue. It's actually even worse because, what's the exchange for a coconut for, say, a fish? It's going to depend on the person and whether that person has a fish already. There's even more, say, inequity or, say, inequality and, say, bad, say, exchanges between that because, let's put it this way. So a glass of water to someone in an oasis doesn't mean much of anything. A glass of water to someone in the desert means a lot. So there's actually a lot different, say, units of exchange in the bartering system between those two entities because supply and demand are different in those areas. Same way, if you have lots of fish, those fish are going to be more valuable or less valuable in an area with lots of fish because everyone can fish. Fish are just like limitless and easy to catch. But if you have an environment where, say, fish aren't as easily available, or let's take lobster because everyone loves lobster. I don't like lobster, but in other places in the country where lobster is not that available because they have to ship it out and it's hard to keep fresh, well, people will pay a ton of money, like $50 for a plate of lobster, like insane amounts of money, and it's not even that good. They come up here and we have available lobster. The price of the lobster is far cheaper and it's far better. So there's these inequities exchanges dependent on supply and demand, and bartering system isn't a great way to solve that. A monetary system kind of helps with all of those issues, but even then, it's not going to be perfect, but it's better than the bartering system.
Absolutely. And I agree, lobster is not that good. And it's also really difficult to eat. And I can never figure out the things that you're supposed to use to crack the claws. Like I just sit there and squeeze it and nothing happens. Like the claw keeps spinning around inside the. Yeah. Have you ever tried to do it?
I don't like
I have no
fish
idea what I'm doing.
or crab or anything
But
like that, so I avoid it.
yeah,
I only bring up lobster because my girlfriend ate some lobster today, and I kissed her, and I was like,
yeah, it's actually really barbaric too. And I eat lobster because I get it free every 4th of July at my wife's aunt's house. But other than that, I wouldn't choose to eat it. I went on a date once when I was 19, and we were going to get some dinner, but we want to go to the beach, so we were gonna go to Shaw's and just buy some food and take it to the beach. And this woman buys king crab legs out of the seafood section.
mm,
And we get in the car, and she's just sitting there snapping these shells with her teeth and sucking the meat out while she's driving.
mm,
And it smells awful. It's filling up the whole car, and there's these slurping noises. And then it's like, well,
uh,
this date's ruined, and also I'm never gonna eat seafood ever again. And now I'm a vegetarian.
yeah.
So
I mean,
that
both of
explains.
those things sound
Yeah.
awful. I mean, the lobster and the vegetarianism, both terrible.
Yeah, I know. You like your meats.
No, I'm of course kidding, but I'm not about the first
Yeah,
part with the slurping. Oh, that sounds disgusting. In a car too, like you can't escape that shit.
yeah, it's awful, even with the windows down.
So
But anyway, getting back to the conversation here.
I got a question for you.
I think that okay,
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 so I'm going to interrupt here because I want to know your opinion in this. So we're talking about kind of inequities with, say, bartering system, and I want to know what you think first before I give my own opinion. Because in a bartering system, is it not true that your, say, experience would be determined by that bartering system, and that there also wouldn't be those same equities in, say, allocation? Like, there's gonna be some person who just happens to get a lot of fish, and they're gonna be like the king because they're gonna have all the food. You know what I mean?
yeah. That's kind of what I was trying to illustrate when I said that it's not the money that creates the problems. When people say that capitalism creates greed, I don't think that's it. I think that greed was always there, and I think that yes, compound interest is a powerful vehicle And I understand people's point about the multiplicity of money, but there's also multiplicity of resources. I mean, in the case of fish, there's obviously some expiration date. So somebody can't sit on top of a hoard of fish forever, and put it in a Scrooge McDuck vault and jump into it. It wouldn't work. You would have to get rid of the fish at some point or they would lose their value. So it's slightly different. But what I'm saying is that you can create a situation where you control the resources. I mean, if you're the main fisherman on the island, then it's possible that you could control the other people who are trying to fish. I mean, whether it's that you're bullying those people or whether they're people that work under you or maybe you're the only person that knew how to fish and you instructed everybody else. So now you get a share of what I mean, you know what I'm saying? There's all kinds of scenarios that can happen here
Hmm. Yeah.
where and then what if yeah, if we haven't even gotten into property rights, but if we wanted to go all John Locke on this, like what if you were the person that owned the only patch of land with coconut trees on it? Then what are other people supposed to do about that? That's kind of a monopoly in itself if you're on a 100-person island.
So I want to actually go into this a little bit because this could get it kind of more interesting. So with property rights and the idea that John Locke has is this idea of homesteading, and it's the idea is like a claim to property must involve some, say, nurturing and care of that property. So let's say you find this island, you can't just plant a flag in the islands and say, this is my island, right? Because yeah, you're claiming it, but who's to say that you actually own that? Like, what's the actual aspect of ownership that, say, transforms that land into your ownership? And the idea there is that you will homestead the property, that you kind of make it yours. And in this way, maybe you set up, say, a camp or a base there, and you start kind of farming the land, you start kind of modifying it, and then kind of it's essentially the extent to which you kind of own or you control out is the extent to which you own that property. Now, this gets a little bit confusing in, say, more tribal societies because they'll essentially don't really set up camp anywhere. They just kind of roam and kind of forage. But in the case of it, say, someone like actually establishes a camp somewhere, that person's homesteading land, they're making use of it. They're combining labor to land, as John Locke would say, and that kind of gives elicitation to, say, their ownership of that thing. And the idea is that the value of something is not present until you actually unlock it. One analogy I think that's made is imagine like there's like a treasure chest and there's gold inside that treasure chest, but it has like a super, super complicated lock that's impossible to like just crack. That treasure chest is actually, has no value until you actually are able to open it. If that treasure chest could not be opened, there's no value of that treasure chest because you can't get the resources inside. You have to unlock it with, say, some labor. That labor might be lockpicking, it might be, say, hitting it with a hammer, it might be doing something, right? But you have to do something to get that value out of it. In a similar way, if you, see a coconut tree, right? That coconut tree has coconuts, which are edible and, have some value. But that coconut tree and the coconuts on it have no value until you actually mix your labor with that coconut tree and actually climb to the top of it or, throw a rock at one of the coconuts, do something to get it down. So it's important, I think, to realize that it's like you can't just claim ownership. You have to actually, ownership is an active sort of thing. In a similar way, let's say that you have a sandwich and you're kind of like out on some, say, park bench, and then you leave that sandwich there for a day, 2 days, 3 days. I mean, at what point do you lose your ownership? It's a little bit vague, the exact point, but after 3 days, I think we can assume that sandwich that's not yours anymore. If someone throws it out, you can't really, be like bothered by it. So
that could be argued only because the sandwich expires, but what if you left a pair of shoes there? I mean, shoes don't expire. It's hard to say with something like that, but with your other example of the coconut trees, that thought experiment has actually been done with oil. And in Alaska, they have a sort of universal basic income type experiment, which they do based on the commodity of oil, because there's oil found in many places in Alaska. But the argument really is that somebody's got to do the labor. It's going to take somebody has to drill the oil, but at the same time, the land is owned by the people, and so the people allow the use of that land in exchange for a tax, and that tax is passed on in the form of UBI. So yes, the people who are doing the drilling, they still profit off of the oil, but they have to pay taxes on the profits, which is then distributed to the landowners. So this is one clever way that we can use a sort of monetary system to create equity in these situations, because there's all kinds of problems with the coconut situation without a monetary system. Because let's say that the person who owns the coconut trees is putting their labor into it, but they're just really bad at raising coconut trees. So the quality of the coconuts is bad. The quantity is not sufficient for the number of people that are there, but because they're putting their labor into the land, we can't technically seize it from them because that would be immoral, right? But at the same time, the resources could be maximized if somebody who knew what they were doing could take over. And so that's sort of the contract with the oil dividends is, right? There are people who know how to drill this, and although we own the land, we don't know how to drill it. So if we lend you our land, you can come in and drill it. We just want a piece of the action. And so to me, I think that's a very fair way of solving the bargaining, the bartering issue when it comes to actual tangible resources that we can see.
I'm
What do you
I'm not as certain about that one because I this is essentially the case of some entity claiming, say, ownership of the land without doing anything to put effort into it, and then essentially paying other people to kind of harness the energy and kind of charging them a dividend or charging them like a price. And it's something that's been done for quite some time. So, ancient Egypt, for instance, they were one of the most wealthy states out there, and it's because they owned all the farmland. Like, it was super good farming land, so they used it, and they were one of the major producers of food in general. But all the pharaohs owned all the farmland, and the pharaohs would have, say, their workers. They actually contracted out, the people to use the farmland, and they would pay them some share of it, but they're in order to do it, they would be charged some sort of price and all this kind of stuff. Like it kind of essentially like a big tax. So they own the land, but the farmers essentially produce all the resources, and you could say that's kind of an exploitative sort of system.
That's a little different. That's more along the lines of coercion, and that's not really what I'm describing. This is a willful exchange of goods. Because technically, let's say that I owned a piece of land that has oil on it. Technically, I could drill that if I knew how, right? But I don't. And also, there's a barrier to entry. And I don't know exactly what that barrier is because I'm not an expert. I've never drilled oil, but I can reasonably speculate that the equipment and expertise required to do it is a rather large barrier to entry. So my choice would basically be I could refuse the use of my land and then nobody gets the oil and I also don't get the dividend, or I could enter into this willful exchange of goods, which is you can drill on my land, and in exchange, I get a dividend for whatever profit is made off of what is in the land. And I would say that's a little bit different than the government having forced production. And the other difference is that I don't have to do any work,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm willing to let somebody take advantage of a resource that I own because I myself either am incapable or don't want to put in the labor required to harvest it.
Yeah.
But in the case of the pharaohs, they're telling the farmers they have to produce
Hmm.
and that a certain percentage of the profits being taken. I mean, that's a form of slavery.
Yeah. Okay. So I think we agree on that distinction there. It's not fully distinct, in my opinion, because I still think the claim of ownership of that land is a little bit improper. But yeah, there's a difference there in that the pharaohs were, say, demanding, say, production of, say, food, whereas in this case, there's not a demand. It's just more like a contract invitation sort of thing. It's a voluntary. It's more voluntary, but I do question the claim of, say, property of the land. Because like in this
And,
case, the government could just say, "I own all this land," and then actually, this kind of what happens. They say that they own everything essentially, and that you have to pay taxes on that land because it's essentially being bought from them in a technical sense.
if I may, actually, I'd say that in modern days, the version of John Locke's property rights is a little different because when you're talking about like homesteading or colonization or when you're going into and living off the land for the first time is a little different because you have to build everything from the ground up. And so when you're talking about putting in your effort, like you literally built the house, you built the farm, you worked the farm. Most people don't do that these days because we go to jobs at a bank or at an office or, at an internet company or whatever it is. And we don't own those companies in any way. But what happens instead is that we go to those places and we get paychecks and then we use our money to pay for mortgages and property taxes. So our taxes that go to the government, that's us working the land in a modern day sense. So we still have property rights in the sense that we are putting our labor somewhere. It might not be that we're laboring directly on the land where we live, but we're putting labor into society in the form of taxes. Does that make sense?
Not fully, but I say we get back. I think we're just going to disagree at this point, because uh, I see it as being a little bit too high level, if that makes sense. Like,
Yeah.
it's like an abstraction on an abstraction, and I'd probably have to think about it a bit more. But let's get back to finances a little bit, because the jobs we have are kind of disconnected from, say, a direct output sort of sense, kind of like you were saying earlier with the bartering system. Like bartering, it can, if you're in a simple society, it could make sense. The more abstract a society gets, the more, say, distinct or more abstract like our actual production goes. Like if you own a business, it's pretty straightforward, because you have costs, you have revenue, you have all these different things. It's clear you're making your money if you're at like a basic shop. But like you and I both worked at a bank, and how we make money at a bank, it's very abstract. It's not, there's like, we kind of know how it works a little bit, but it's not really clear how we're producing, say, goods and services, like how we're not producing money for the bank. It's a little bit unclear. And I think that's an issue that people have with evaluating, say, the value of money, to put it more bluntly, because what we're actually doing to produce things is kind of just vague and like, okay.
Yeah, the interesting thing about banks is that if you think about it, really, we're creating the situation in which our goods and services are needed. As in, if banks had never existed in the first place, then a lot of the things that banks do wouldn't be necessary, if that makes sense. I've thought about that many times. Like, we have different loans that we do, but at the same time, it's because of sort of systems that we've perpetuated and created in the first place that these things are even necessary. That's a little off track too. I think what we were originally trying to do here was figure out whether you can be happy without money, right? And we kind of discussed a lot of different things today, like whether a monetary system makes sense, which I think it does. I think we agree on that, and what the implications are of that monetary system. But then the question is, do you have to participate in that system to be happy? And I kind of think you do. I don't think everybody needs to be wealthy. I don't think that we all have to necessarily strive to make more money. I think we just have to figure out what it is we want from life, and then we have to find a niche, a place where we're making enough money to achieve what we're trying to do. I think where people go wrong is maybe that they focus too much on wealth accumulation or materialism, and maybe they're taking the money too literally. Like, I want to get as much as I can. But it's not about the money. It's like we said earlier, it's about what the money represents, right? So if
Mm.
you have the things that you want, then what good is the additional money?
Right. And if I think there's a base level of, say, monetary value where you can get the best bang for your buck. Like, I still think there might be some diminishing returns you can get, but there's been a couple studies in this too. Like, I think it's like $70,000-$80,000 a year. That's where people are most happy, or not when they're most happy, but that's where like the peak kind of level of returns come. It's like when things start leveling off around there. So if someone can get to that point, they have enough money to feel secure. They can have a good enough lifestyle to kind of, not be unhappy, I think is a way to put it. Maybe not disgruntled. When they can afford everything they need. They can, live a good life, a decent neighborhood, and they can take trips, do things they want. And I think I think it's harder to be happier with less, but I think it's possible. But it's just harder to achieve. It takes work. Like you could even say that the people who are able to achieve happiness without, say, money or without resources or without, say, different things in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, those people have to put in work into themselves to achieve that. Either that or just happen to be born that way. But a Buddhist monk who can live a happy and peaceful life with nothing, they spent years and years training their mind to that state. You could say that they kind of homesteaded that themselves. Instead of creating something monetary, external, they actually create something internal. But that took work to do. So I think there's a false equivalence there. Maybe they weren't building, say, money or monetary value, but they're building mental value, and they're reaping the rewards of that, where they don't have to have as much there. So I think in general, more the better, but also more money, more problems at a certain point. If you're like a multi-billionaire, that's going to be tough either way, because you're going to have tons of people trying to get your money. But if you're at like say a middle point there, I think that's probably more suitable than not. But I also think if you put enough work in your mind, you can kind of abstain from that either way. But I don't think there's a better or worse. I think it's just different ways within life.
And that's good feedback. So I think time is a currency too, and that's kind of one of the things I'm taking for what you're saying, is that regardless of what the actual monetary exchange is, there's an exchange of time, and that can matter. So you need to find that sweet spot where the exchange of your time is worthwhile for the outcomes that you're receiving.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think I would have one more question that kind of relates to this topic, and then we could wrap things up. And what it is that there's a lot of people that seem to claim, in one form or another, some more extreme than others, that money is actually the root of evil. I'm sure you've heard this before.
Mm-hmm.
So if we've sort of arrived at the conclusion here that you do need some money to be happy, but maybe there's a level of that and there's some type of balancing act, where does that balancing act come from? Is maybe the assertion people are making about it being evil, is it because the existence of money and the sort of connotations that the money is tied to positive outcomes and perceived happiness? Does this corrupt our thinking? Does it make us greedier, or does it make us in this constant state of pursuit? Like endless ambitions that
Mm-hmm.
the goalpost is always moving. We're always striving for more. And this is because of the existence of money, right? And the fact that you can get more. Like,
Right.
I'd be interested to know what would happen if there was a cap. And that would be a terrible idea. I'm not advocating for this. I'm just saying, what if there was a cap and you knew that at some point you could only make a certain amount of money and you'd reached it? I wonder how that would change your mindset, and if perhaps that is somehow tied to the assertion that money is evil. What's your opinion?
So there's a couple of different things there with a couple of different questions. I'll talk about the root of all evil. And I think in a way you could say it is, but in another sense, it doesn't mean it's bad. I mean, evil is bad, of course, but I think that money is, say, the harnessing of sin and to productive power. In the same way, I think that a lot of, say, virtue requires controlled violence. This kind of goes back to like a Jordan Peterson quote, who's a famous Canadian psychologist, philosopher. But a part of your journey in life is kind of realizing that maybe you have this evil within you, and that you have, say, a capacity for violence, and controlling that violence into a, say, productive output. You're actually controlling it in a way that can be good. In the same way, I think money is kind of monetary systems and capitalism in general is kind of a maybe not fully positive output, but it's a directional output where it kind of harnesses the sins of humanity into something that might be productive. Because it gives you things which maybe are bad, but it's a productive sort of bad. And there's also things it gives which are, just good. And I think it's kind of like you can't get the good without the bad to some degree, because if you have a system which is wide open, where you can kind of do most anything you want, not really, but let's say the system's more open than it being, say, over the top constrained, kind of constructed, then you're gonna get some bad with the good, but it's gonna be mostly good. And so I think that is my idea. It is the root of all evil, but that doesn't mean it's not productive and it's not bad or it's not good. It can be good. It can also be bad, but I think the harnessing of, say, humanity's sin into a positive direction is far better than kind of keeping back into a land of that lacks good and evil, where it lacks ambition, it lacks anything. It's a weird, complicated point, but that's my thought.
That's very sort of meta philosophy, and it's probably hard for people to wrap their minds around. I'm sitting here scratching my head a little bit, but I think I think that it's right on though, and I would say just in a really simplified way that I think that if money didn't exist, people would find ways to fulfill those desires anyway. So all of the sort of things that we lust after because of the existence of money, allegedly, right? We would lust after them anyway, but we would just find different ways to obtain them, which
Hmm.
kind of goes back to the bartering thing earlier. And I think the corruption would still exist even if there wasn't money, because the sins are inherent to human beings, right? Whether you just are a philosophical person or a religious person, I mean, there's different iterations of that belief, but what our flaws are as human beings are not because of a monetary system. And there's been many systems tried throughout history, and it it, it doesn't create these problems. They were always here.
Yeah, I want to take a direct example just to make my point more illicit. Maybe take prostitution for instance. So imagine that a man or a woman, let's say a man, wants sex, back before, say, let's say even the age of bartering. Let's say bartering's been around for a while, but he wants sex, but he doesn't have really means to attain that. So you could imagine this was some bartering system where he does something and same sort of thing. But let's say he has no other way of attaining it, so he has to take it like a woman by force. So through society, we actually created, say, prostitution, and you exchange, say, money, or you could say resources, whatever you want to do, but in exchange for sex. And that exchange is maybe a elicitation of sin. Maybe it's something which is negative, but it's less bad than rape. And it's better to have prostitution than to have forced sex. And so this channel of commerce, which is the industry of prostitution and sex work, is a manifestation of the sin of humanity, but the sin is productive in that it's doing more good than bad.
Yeah, some people might argue though
Hmm?
that the existence or the tolerance of some forms of prostitution leads to human trafficking. So, I mean, that's a whole complex argument in of itself. But I would say that we're certainly not advocating for that when we say, that it's better than the alternative. But really, what we're saying is, okay, if there wasn't a monetary system, if there was no exchange present, this stuff would still happen. But
Hmm.
the method of exchange would simply be different.
Hmm.
And in your example, most likely would be more violent in many instances because there isn't a sort of medium that we can use to channel that.
Right, right. And this is also where language gets super interesting because a big part of, say, okay, we don't go too long, but I think big thing of, say, monetary exchange is actually contract because essentially words we're using to establish, say, agreement for two parties. Because let's say I go into a shop, I give you a donut, and then you gave me $1, right? There's an exchange there, and we have a receipt which kind of shows that contract, dollar for the donut. Or you go into, say, a bank and open an account with some sort of interest rate, and then you get like the disclosures and the account information. So there's an exchange happening there and a contract in between. And a lot of monetary exchanges are essentially contract exchanges that have some sort of validation. And certainly there's an exchange that happens there, but the exchange is ultimately happening through words and agreement between the two different parties. So it's the voluntariness which kind of matters in that, and the specifications of that exchange.
Like, so I think we agree about most things. A couple things in there, a little choppy, but ultimately, I think that you do need some money to be happy. You don't need to be wealthy, but everybody has some degree of wealth that they would have to determine is they're comfortable degree of wealth, and to obtain that, there's going to be some type of sacrifice of time. So that factor has to be considered by the individual as well. And is it evil? Perhaps there is some good and some evil built into the system, but I think it's inherent to humans and it would exist regardless of money. So I don't think money is the root of evil. I think that it is just involved in it.
Yeah. I think we're gonna have to hash out this whole property rights argument and discussion because we got kind of hung up there, to be honest. And I think we could go for like a couple hours on that, to be honest.
Yeah, we'll save that for another episode. And on that note too, if anybody that's watching has any suggestions for things that you'd like to hear us discuss, or if you have any questions about any of the stuff that we discussed today, or you just think that Nathan's an asshole like I do, I'd love if someone would agree with me. So just leave a comment for us and hit the like button too if you can. We appreciate it.
Subscribe, hit the bell. That way you know when new videos are coming up. I've been trying to get on a schedule with these. We're trying to record these regularly. So the release schedule right now, I have a couple in the tank that are scheduled for every Wednesday. So we're hoping that we can keep these going out every Wednesday. So one episode per Wednesday. It might be once every 2 weeks, but I'm going to try aim for a week right now. Or, I haven't talked with actors about this explicitly, but we said once every 2 weeks, ideally, or at the very least. But once a week would be good. But yeah, so expect that, and definitely subscribe if you want to see when the next video comes out. And if you have the bell, you'll know right when it comes out.
Yeah, and then again, if you do want to hear anything specific, I mean, we'll literally debate anything. So
Yeah,
we did this every day when we used to work together, and it would help us a lot if you'd make suggestions.
we drove some of our coworkers crazy with some of the nuances we're debating.
Yeah, nuance is a great word. It's some of these go on way too long.
All right. Well, you guys definitely have a great rest of your day, and thank you for watching the. No, that's not a good way to end it. Shit. Does it matter?
I don't think it does, but then again, does anything?
Matter.